if you thought that the pandemic ended years ago, basically what happened in the narrative is that what the Dutch government or many of the Empire Core government said is that basically they said the emergency as they define it ended in, for example, for the Netherlands in May 2022. But that is not the same as the virus is not still like generically in the population, circulating in the population. And to be able to say something like that, like the virus is still here, we probably need to look at some data. So I'm going to use some graphs. This is how the Dutch government kind of describes the whole process, and if you see, you have the long-term strategies in May of 2022. But let's go to some data so that I can tell you why it's still ongoing. I can already kind of give you a spoiler. Basically, what we see on this graph are two things. On the one that are filled are basically how many tests were conducted, while the other one is basically the positive percentage of those tests. Okay, so what you would kind of imagine that if like the pandemic was over in, let's say, in the period when we stopped basically really testing, or where the tests, because the emergency was over, were not as available as they were before, we would see the same kind of thing as well with the percentages, but we don't. It's still there, and what is it? Who are we testing? We are testing people who have a health crisis, people who are at the hospital, people that have enough symptoms to basically the doctor asking, oh, maybe it's COVID-19, right? So what we're seeing is that, in fact, the virus is still there. But if we are not testing anymore, we're probably not reporting anymore as well. And we're doing other stuff that we kind of stopped doing, right? So how do we know that it's really, really still in like a generic population, like the difference between pandemic and endemic? Endemic is something regional. Pandemic is global. So when we're talking about endemics or that kind of things, we should not use that word if you're not talking about a disease that has been like politically seen as only existing in a region. So what do we have for that? We have something that, in fact, I as well put some things so that it maybe is a bit easier. What we have to be able to, in fact, say that the virus is still there is wastewaters, which we as well test for things like drugs, just as information. So the first two graphs are basically the wastewater and the infection rate numbers basically for the Netherlands in the first 3 years. And we see that kind of it's not exactly the same peaks, I know as well. The yellow one is not really the best color for this, but you can kind of, at least with the brown ones, see more or less the same kind of pattern, right? And that was basically beginning of 22. The scale is in weeks, and it's not really like the days, because this is basically the start of the year. And so when we talk about May 22, we are basically talking about this period here on the yellow line, right? And you see, it's going down, right? But why is it going down? At that point, we had still the mask mandates, and most people got the primary series, like most people, I think we were talking about 70% in the Netherlands, had the primary series and the first booster. So 3 shots. And we see the numbers going down because we have mandates, people are vaccinated, and so on and so on. But if that is the end, right? What the P is that thing that's out there? What is this, right? This is basically December 23 to January 24, and we have an enormous peak. Now, wastewater data is not perfect. And it's not perfect because it's not one-on-one with cases. Not only that, but the virus, the different variants of the virus do shed different amounts of itself, basically. So you're sick, you go to the toilet, that ends up in the wastewater, basically. But it is obvious that there is still something going on. I mean, the red line, this one down here, even though it's slow, it's still there. We still have COVID going around normally in our environments. And just keep in mind, if something is happening in the imperial core and it looks kind of iffy, so the global south is P. Like, I don't know how to say it, it's vague, basically. That is usually the play. So, if this is true, and the pandemic is physically still here, what happened to us? As in, why are we not anymore acting like we are in a pandemic? And for that, I will borrow a definition from the authors of Health Communism, where they call this the sociological production of the end of the pandemic. And this is something that is composed of both policy and narrative. The narrative is helping us to shift the minds of the people that this is not a problem, and the policy is helping us remove the protection that were there during the emergency period. So either is support for the people that cannot work or stuff like that, right? So this kind of slowly happened, and I will try to a bit outline how we got there before going into some more historic stuff about why I don't think we can have health under this system. I don't know how many of you remember, but we had a discussion that was very intense if the spread of SARS-CoV-2 is droplet-based. That was what we were using. And it's not, it's airborne. What is the difference? Droplet is basically, you are sick, you start coughing, you start sneezing. Basically the pathogen trapped that is getting from your lungs gets spread around you, and if you're unlucky enough that somebody is in front of you and that pathogen gets on them, either their hands because they are doing something on their face, or directly their nose, mouth, they get infected, right? And that means that the main thing that we do in that kind of situation is clean our hands, clean the surfaces, be kind of, not sneezing to the other persons and stuff like that. What if it's airborne, and what does it mean to be airborne? We had two exceptions before 2020 that we looked at as airborne. Those are tuberculosis and measles. Tuberculosis is kind of how we define airborne if we're not talking about biological weapons, and that is as well a discussion, kind of funny discussion that kind of goes in there. But to reiterate, what the problem is that basically the virus sits in aerosols, and when you're breathing, they can travel much longer distances than just you sneezing, which means that even the 5 meter thing of distance was not correct. Because basically in here, we are now sharing air. That's why I have as well a meter there. And if anybody noticed, we went from 800 at the beginning of the talk, and now that everything is slow, we're already at 1,300. That's a CO2 meter. We're going to discuss it at the end, but just so that you see how that number changes through the conversation. So how do we do things if we have an airborne virus? Basically the air becomes our enemy. As simple as that. Which means that we need to have a good infrastructure for ventilation, for filtration, and for things like UV lights that help us kill the pathogens. This is systemic because you need to do it in all the buildings. And on the other hand, let's say on parallel, you would need as well PPE, so personal protection equipment for the people that are working, think about healthcare. And think about how the anti-mask sentiment has gone up as of the start in 2020. And how people who were on cancer wards normally have worn a mask at least, are now not wearing it anymore. So we are in this beautiful disaster of miscommunication. There was, in the places of Twitter I was on, there were whole debates about when the World Health Organization finally said, yes, this is an airborne pathogen. And they did at some point, but there was no press release. So, how many of you remember how we were discussing essential workers at the beginning of 2020? Who was marked as essential worker? Right? Can you, what comes to mind is the person that had to go to work, to let's say McDonald's or stuff, to have to prepare the food without a PPE because there was no PPE for these people, and had to do it for somebody who could work from home, and was like, yeah, but I don't want to lose my routine, so I'm gonna go for the burger that I'm used to. That, or the fact that we celebrated healthcare workers when at the beginning, right? And then forgot about them. They had to go in without PPE. They saw horrible stuff. They saw people saying goodbye to their relatives through windows, stuff like that. It was bad. It was very, very. We have usually after this kind of situation a bunch of burnouts, which makes sense. So, putting this whole thing together and adding on top of that the minimizing that we heard is just a flu. It will only affect the weak and the vulnerables, those that have a pre-existing condition. It does not do anything to children. So, if you combine everything that I just said, even at some point, Dr. Anthony Fauci said something like, older people, the ill, the disabled will fall by the wayside. And then we decided to go with the vaccine-only solution. So why is vaccine-only solution a real problem? Is it because of the vaccine? No. It's because if you really correctly look at something like a pandemic and how do we treat it, we need multiple layers of protection. And that's why it's called the Swiss cheese healthcare model. And if you see, I think you can see the first cheese slice here is vaccine. So vaccine is part of the mitigation, but it's not supposed to happen on its own. Not in this kind of pandemic as the SARS-CoV-2 is. So instead of going for this, we went with one layer only, said it was the silver bullet, didn't explain how vaccines work. To give you an ABC of vaccines, each vaccine or each disease has its own herd immunity number. Meaning, measles, 95% of the population has to be covered with vaccines. Polio, 80% of the population has to be covered with vaccines to have herd immunity, so to protect those 5 or 20% of the population that are not vaccinated. For COVID, we don't know where the herd immunity is. We don't know even if we can get it. Since all the vaccines that we have at the moment maximally work for 6 months, and we never had above 80% of vaccination in the imperial core. Just those two. Last one, you do not get immunity from getting the virus. Your immune system will be weakened. So there is a lot of little elements in there, and one of them is as well this ignorant way of doing things that can as well exacerbate other discussions like the anti-vaccine discussion. Where, for example, and I want to mention this because I think it's important, we did have through all these two specific things that we could call vaccine injuries. One of them is basically myocarditis, which is an inflammation of the heart muscles. But it turned out, when we finally got some data in, because this is a thing that I think a lot of people don't understand. We have looked at this virus for 6 years. That's it. We don't have years of history with it, right? So we have done a bunch of research about it. It is the most researched virus probably at the moment, but we don't have the whole history of it. Like, we know what SARS-CoV was doing, so we can kind of a bit imagine, but we don't know physically this specific virus, right? So it turns out that even for the myocarditis stuff, it is much more risky to be infected with SARS-CoV-2 than it is like that you will get this myocarditis the first 2 weeks after the vaccine. So basically, it's still so upset that the vaccine is still a much better call, basically. And the other one, which is something very specific for a very small cohort of people, they do get post-vaccination syndrome in the case of the mRNA vaccine. And it just is in the preprint, the paper that they are doing this on, and even the researchers that are looking into this and have said, yes, this is, we can see from the kind of consequences it leaves in the body that what activated is in fact connected with the vaccine. Even them said, at the end of the day, the risk of COVID-19 is higher than any of these other post-vaccine injuries. It's like not a real like, what do we say, offset. And to bring it back just to the new virus, please think about HIV/AIDS. How much time was a delay between the first infection and us realizing that there were consequences after the infection? There is a lag that happens between the infection and the post-viral syndrome. And we are not there yet. We need a few more years to see really the whole spectrum of consequences this has brought. But to bring it back, there have been basically scientists that have been trying their best to do their work. Meanwhile, there have been people who I would call adjunct to science, who have been basically feeding the anti-vax movement. And so I would like to give you a rule of thumb, because I know that this needs really a lot of discernment to like go through, basically. Is one of the people that are talking to you, let's say that you have a scientist and somebody, this is adjunct to the sciences, talking to you, is one of them trying to either sell you supplements, workshops, MLM, any of that? Or, for example, can you say that they are trying to maybe put on the market another vaccine, which is just the separation of the original vaccine they're saying that might be causing autism? Yep, this was Andrew Wakefield, who had a patent for that. Anyway, follow the money as well. But now now that we have kind of seen how this pandemic has played out, so all the disasters that we have seen, I would like to just very quickly touch upon some things that kind of feed into it. The first one is, let's think about the kind of culture, thought process comes with healthcare, specifically in the imperial core, and specifically in the US, because US is the one that is now exporting, and we're going to go into the mechanism very quickly later. Let's say you're in the US, you have cancer. You somehow survived that cancer. Now you have debt. That debt is enormous. You go into bankruptcy. You have bankrupt yourself because of healthcare. But you might hear something along the lines of this. It has happened in the first place because of your moral failing. As you didn't stop consuming seed oils, stop using 5G, stop thinking negative thoughts, or even supercharge your cancer with the job. Hence, moral failing. That's gonna be very hard. Okay, but to bring it back, it is not the toxic refuse that was buried in your neighborhood. It is not the fact that you cannot pay for healthcare, right? It is not what we would call the social determinants of health. Which I will help with. So we are basically saying it's a moral failing. It's not what, you know, it's on you. It's not on the things that are influencing your health, but it's on you that you are not healthy, basically. As I don't have much time, I'm just gonna kind of run through this. But basically, there are mechanisms. First ones happening, kind of kicking off in the 50s, connected with patents of medication, where basically the companies can withhold the licensing of a patent so that people cannot produce the medicine. Or abandoning medicine because it's not important enough. Because it's just for those with tuberculosis in Southeast Asia. Right? We are not really so concentrated on that. Or, on the other hand, if you have patents and you can start managing who is producing what, you can start calling some of the diseases illicit and build up a whole narrative around it. For example, in the 50s, the US had this whole thing where, what was it, how did they call it? Chemical heroin warfare that was perpetuated by the Chinese Communist Party. Drowning the streets of the US with drugs. Not true, but that is a very nice narrative that you can spin, especially when you have a war going on, and you can say something like, teenage addicts in New York are helping to pay for the shell that kill American boys in Korea. Something like that. And if you're still not happy and you're strong enough, you have a government behind you as a company, you can always step in and go like, we're gonna have retaliation. That is one, let's say, part of it. And then in the 90s, we see the push to privatization, basically. What we see is, imagine like that. You are a poor country, you need a loan. The IMF or the World Bank comes in and says, we're gonna look at your books. If we like it, you get the loan. What do they come up with? I think that your social, your social spending is kind of out of control. Do something about it, you get a loan. And I'm gonna give you a real life example. 2017, the Dutch Caribbean island of San Martin was hit by the Hurricane Irma. When COVID happened, so basically this 17 to 2020, the Dutch government gave them a loan to start rebuilding. COVID kicks in, economy halts. They have a liquidity problem again. They go back to the Dutch government, hey, we kind of need help. And we heard as well that you have the vaccine. Can we have? And the Dutch government said, yes, but. What was the ask? To basically cut the spending in the public sector. So they had to spend, in 3 years, they cut 12% of the employees' salaries and 25% of the office holders. Applies as well to Aruba and Curacao. So you can push countries through this kind of mechanism, especially with the healthcare insurances behind it, as the ones that are able to cut on waste. Because social spending is a waste. It's a burden on society. It's a burden on the taxpayer. Anyway, so we see a real conspiracy in play. Basically, we see governments and companies basically trying to make demands on the poorer countries. But this is complex. It's a system. It's hard. You have to analyze this. There is no solution that is from today to tomorrow, right? Conspiracy theory, on the other hand, having a tracker in your vaccine, on the other hand, is easy to solve. You don't get the jab, right? And there is like this mentality where basically you go to the internet tells you, oh, this mind-blowing thing, and basically telling you that you're powerless and cannot do anything because of the demonic forces fighting the eternal war between good and evil. What do you prefer? What will you fight? All right? Anyway, I'm just going to conclude because I really have almost no time left with something that was told in 2020 by a disability justice activist, which basically told us things will get worse. If there is a pandemic, things will get worse. What do we mean with this? What I mean with this is that we have seen historically, every time a pandemic hits, there is a change in society. The first big one are the poor laws from the 14th century, which followed the Black Plague. And that is because we lost 30% of the population in Europe. We lost 30% of the guild workers, basically. And they could start demanding things. So poor laws happened, and compulsory work happened. And then the influenza of 1918 hit, and we got the revisation of eugenics, and things like the Action T4 program, which, if you didn't know, started as a sterilization thing and then continued in euthanasia, mostly of children. But to bring it back, it's a very similar rhetoric that we heard as well in the current pandemic, where the virus is basically weeding out the weak, the meek. And the irony is that this pandemic is a mass disabling event. Mass disabling event. Which means that the weak and the meek that we are trying to cool are in fact more and more. Just to give you a perspective, if you heard about long COVID, if you heard about post-COVID, for the general public in the Netherlands, the number is 12.7% if you ever had an infection. You could as well not know that you had an infection because there is a very big part of the infection that are asymptomatic. You still could have consequences. And that is 12.7%. If we look at the studies for the West Bank, that number jumps to 41.6 of people that were in the study had long COVID. Think about as well the fact that Israel was withholding the vaccines. And you don't want long COVID. Long COVID is a lot of issues with fatigue, with brain fog, with not being able to participate anymore in the society. And basically, the one that is most close to long COVID, like the bigger one, because it's more of an umbrella, it's not just one version of a syndrome. The one that is mostly connected with it is something called myalgic encephalomyelitis or chronic fatigue syndrome, which is a disease that we know about from 1939. It was first acknowledged as a real disease in 2015. Do you know which population gets more targeted by this stuff? Women. They were heard as hysteric, as psychologically having some kind of psychosis. It's a real thing. And we took this long time. There is no research on cures or treatment. And it's one of the least financed diseases we have, and it's basically very similar to what long COVID is. I'm going to leave it at this and close it off with something maybe a bit more positive.
Right.
Thank you.